everyone, welcome to the community classroom. This is Dr. Tracy McCarthy. We're going to be continuing our discussion about Mysterion, and we're going to take a little turn here. We're going to talk a little bit about some history, philosophy, politics, psychology, religion, all of that. So we're going to tie in some information related to Thomas Hobbes, and we're going to be talking about Leviathan, and not only about Leviathan, that creature that's identified in the Bible. I think it's Job 41. We're also going to be talking about Hobbes' theory and how it ties into this idea of Leviathan. Not only that, there is some unusual connection between the words Leviathan, Leviticus, Levi, and Levite. And so that's what our focus is really going to be on, is this etymology dynamic that's going on with those words. Now, on the surface, it wouldn't seem as though those words have anything to do with each other. However, they are quite integrated. Okay, let's get started. Okay, if you are not familiar with Thomas Hobbes, this is Thomas Hobbes. Now, the pictures on the right and the left are supposed to be depictions of Thomas Hobbes. What's interesting, though, is this book, Leviathan, has an illustration on the front of it. And Leviathan actually looks like Thomas Hobbes on the left-hand side there, only with a little bit more color. And so it's just very interesting that this creature actually looks like the author. And of course, some people might not readily see that because of that dynamic, that color dynamic with the artwork here. And here we have the full title of the book, Leviathan. Okay, so we're going to talk about Hobbes and his little theory. Now, on the surface, Hobbes' theory sounds pretty benign. He talks about social contract theory, and you might have heard some rhetoric about social contracts recently. More recently, over the last year, there has been more public discussion about the need to change the social contract for the entire world. So anyway, in this book, Leviathan, one of the things that Hobbes talks about is the social contract theory. Now, what's important to note about this social contract theory that he espouses is that it's a binding theory. And it's very clear that the benign social contract that you usually think about when you think about social contracts with the government and the people, this is something else going on here. So anyway, when he talks about social contract and Leviathan, it's a very binding theory. And it also suggests a domestic violence theory. And so it turns the idea of social contract theory on its head as he talks about this idea of being bound and also what looks like domestic violence. And so civil and ecclesiastical domestic violence, basically. And so what he talks about is this idea of a global and single church and government absolute rule, but not just that, an absolute ruler. And so it's this idea of a Leviathan, this biblical Leviathan is what he's talking about. And so that's his image of this commonwealth, as he calls it. And so hold on to all of this as we go on this little ride. So remember, we're going to be talking about these words and the etymology relationship between these words. And so we have, again, Leviathan, Leviticus, Levi, and Levite. So let's look at these etymology themes. They are very interesting, by the way. And so what we have here is this idea, this thread that's running through these words, the roots of these words. You have this idea of a crown, and a wreath, a garland, the idea of encircling, surrounding, enclosing, binding, cleaving, and joining. And one thing to keep in mind is that that idea of binding is related to this idea of being bound, and being bound is related to the idea of being enslaved. What's interesting here is that this whole connection can get lost in translation, but what was assistive in terms of seeing this connection was actually Scott Gaelic and Welsh. And so we're going to look at some of these connections. These are very surprising connections, by the way, because there's no way that most people would think that Leviathan and Levite would be connected. So let's look at this etymology. It's an odd etymology with Leviathan, actually. And so when you look at the etymology of Leviathan and you look at it translated into another language, just that IATH that's sitting in the middle of Leviathan, this is very odd, as you will see. And so when you look at that IATH in Scottish Gaelic, it translates to surround, encircle, and enclose, which is the same as a wreath, garland, and a crown. And so we're going to look at what's going on with the Welsh. And here you can also see this notation that the alternative form of IATH in Scottish Gaelic is IADH. Okay, so now we have these translations. Now, when looking at Leviathan in a number of languages, you saw things that were pretty consistent. You didn't see things jumping out that were odd, really. And so you see down below some information about Leviathan. Leviathan is the sea monster identified in a variety of passages with a whale, a crocodile, the devil. You also see Leviathan related to a bull. And so it's very interesting that, generally speaking, Leviathan is related to these ideas related to animals and mythology. But then you go into the Welsh, and interestingly, in the Welsh, as you can see, it's highlighted for you, it's related to Levites. And so here you see in the Welsh, Leviathan translates as Levites. Okay, so this is just so that you can get a pretty good look of the illustration for Hobbes' Leviathan. And you can see all of the details. Now, it's really interesting when you see the actual book and you look at the totality of the illustration. So there's a lot more going on with that illustration, and so you are definitely encouraged to check that out. You can see here that Leviathan presents as a prince or a king and has a staff, and a particular type of staff. And also has his sword there, and is rising up either out of the ocean or out of the ground, and is over all of this. And again, if you see it in the book, the total illustration, you'll get a better picture of what's going on in terms of what is being communicated or related to little Leviathan. So one of the things that you should get out of this, in terms of, we're going to do a little psychological analysis here. So you see in Strong's Concordance that Leviathan is related to this idea of a serpent, and it's in quotation marks, by the way. So Leviathan is supposed to translate to serpent also a sea monster or a dragon. Now, what's interesting about all of this is that you're talking about issues of power. And so when you look at it that way and you look at this symbolically, what it looks like it might be suggesting is that Leviathan is, as Hobbes is thinking, a sea, maritime, marine type of power. Okay, so we're moving on here with this definition coming out of Strong's again. And so you see that this name Leviathan is rooted in this other word, and it is Livyah. So we're going to look a little bit more at that. And so this is a bit more exhaustive. And so you can see Leviathan is related to this idea of mourning, as in mourning. And then it is also related to the root there of lavah, which means a wreathed animal. A serpent, especially a crocodile or some other large sea monster. And also figuratively, this is related to the idea of a dragon and also symbolically as Babylon. So we're going to check out this word here, which is lava with the lavah, and it means to join or to be joined. And here we have that other root, that Leviah, and you see that it means a wreath. And so again, we're coming back to this theme of a wreath, and then with the other one, to join. Here you see an expanded definition. So you see, again, this root is related to a wreath and also a garland. Now, if you've been following along for a while now, you know that this word garland and this word wreath is associated with something else. Now you see this coming together with this idea of joining and wreath. And you see this word, this root, is related to this idea of something being attached, a wreath. And so both of those words coming together, those roots of Leviathan, they come together and they mean attached, a wreath. And so this is that relationship that is forming that you can see here. So now we look at the other meaning related to garland, wreath, and you see crown, and you see this relationship here, and you see that this is mentioned in Revelation. So if you're looking at scripture and you're looking for where this appears, one of the places that this word appears is in Revelation 12. And so it relates to this creature again with heads, multiple heads, and then 7 crowns. And then it gets even more specific about this crown idea. And so it means to bind around. That's what a crown is. It binds around. And so now you start to see that connection, binding, attaching, encircling a crown. And as you recall, this is related to Stephanos and also the idea of Deo. And you see that this, again, this root also is related to the idea of crown, garland. We go further into these roots and we see this Deo, meaning to tie and to bind. And so you can again see that there is this relationship between connecting and attaching and binding and fastening. This goes on even further, and so it talks a little bit more about this idea of compelling. And here you can see a little bit more about Stephanos. And so that's the same as the name Stephen or Stephan or Stefan. So if you see any of those, it means the same thing. And so here we have Stephanos, and it, again, similar to this whole idea related to Leviathan, is about surrounding and a crown. Again, it is a crown, a garland, and specifically a royal crown. And here it gets very specific, meaning to tie and to bind, to imprison prisoners. And so it's really interesting. You start off with this idea of a crown and a garland and binding, and then it starts to evolve into a number of other ways of thinking of binding or enclosing or encircling. Now, what's also interesting about this is that this idea of binding, this is related to that name Rebecca. And so remember that. Now let's jump into Levi. Now, interestingly, this name is not actually pronounced Levi. It looks like it's pronounced Levi. And so that's another way of thinking about that word. And so you see here, Levi is a son of Jacob, and there's also a tribe ascribed to this particular son. Here we can see some spelling variations related to that name Levi and Levi and Levi. And so you can see all of the different variations there. Levinson, so there's quite a variety. Okay, now you can see here Levi again in Strong's Concordance, and you see when you go to that root word, you see it means attached again. And here you see the root again, meaning to join or be joined. And so you see this connection, this cohesiveness between these words. And here with the exhaustive discussion, you see it means to cleave and to join, to unite, and interestingly, to twine. Now, again, going back to that whole idea of the name Rebecca, Rebecca would be Levi's grandmother. And it goes on with this idea of twisting and turning and surrounding and encircling. Now we're going to go to Revelation so that we can see this word in context, this idea of the crowns. And so you see here, there's information. This is Revelation 13, and it says, "And I stood upon the sand of the sea, and then saw a beast rise up out of the sea." Now, interestingly, this little creature has 7 heads and 10 little horns, and on its 10 little horns it has crowns. It has 10 crowns, and upon its little head it has the name of Blasphemy. Now, what's interesting about these descriptions, this beast description, is it sounds like a chimera. And so it's a blend of things, not just one thing. And so it has elements that appear leopard-like. And again, because so much symbolism is going on here, you think about a leopard and spots, but you also have a bear and you have a lion. And so you have a variety here in terms of these animals. And again, this is suggesting a chimera, not one entity, but an entity that has multiple components all rolled into one. So we're going to look at another version of this also, so you can see something a little different here. And when you look at the Wycliffe version, you see that the word crown is replaced with what we saw before. So you can see that there is this connection and that this meaning is consistent. Leviathan, Levi, Levite, you see this connection. And by the way, a Levite, that name comes from Levi, and so it's the descendant of Levi. And you go back to the Geneva version from 1599. Now this is earlier than the King James, and you see the word crown again. So they are used interchangeably, these words. But the important thing to remember is crown is encircling, surrounding, binding, a garland, a wreath. So let's just talk a little bit about this blasphemy that is on Leviathan, or this beast. And so some people get confused about the word blasphemy, but it has a broader meaning than most people tend to think. And so it basically means abusive or scurrilous language. When you look at the root, it's talking about this idea of slander, basically lying. And so you have this idea of something that is bad and it's identified as good, something that is a lie but it's called the truth, something that is wrong but it is called right. And so it's sort of a switching dynamic when you look at the root of blasphemy. And here it gets a little bit more specific. Blasphemy meaning slanderous or evil speaking. And what's interesting here is you see that this idea of slander related to blasphemy in this context is talking about something against God, so this sort of slanderous dynamic against God, but it's also talking about a similar dynamic against men or against humanity. And carrying this a little further, you see this idea of blasphemy meaning to hurt or to injure. So as we wrap this up, we see that there is this unusual relationship in terms of etymology between Leviathan and Leviticus and Levi and Levite. Now this is very odd because at first blush, no one would think that there's a relationship again between Leviathan and Levi or Levite, particularly given the role of this particular son by the name of Levi. And so it's a very odd connection, but what really stands out is that this connection, this etymology connection, is related to this idea of crown, this idea of garland, this idea of coronet, this idea of binding, encircling, and also related to this idea of a power, a specific type of power. And so it's important to keep all of this in mind when you do a little bit more study, and also this odd relationship between this name and Rebecca, because that is the meaning of her name. And so again, this is a very odd relationship, one that's not expected, particularly when you look at what Leviathan is supposed to be representing and then what Levi is supposed to be representing. And so this coming together in this way is very odd. And also the type of power that this is suggesting. And so it goes along with what Hobbes is talking about. This power, this larger than life power, this invisible power, this all-encompassing power, this power from on high. And so it's definitely something to consider. And also you might want to look at Job 41 because it describes Leviathan so that you can get a better idea of what Leviathan is all about and why Hobbes would select this particular creature as the manifestation of this new social contract that Hobbes is talking about in his little treatise there. And so I'm going to leave you with this because this ties into what Hobbes is talking about in his philosophy. And oddly, there is another passage, and this is taken out of the Geneva because it more closely speaks to what Hobbes is talking about. And this is from Ephesians 6:12. And so it talks about not wrestling against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers. And very specifically, it talks about princes. And so that's very interesting because, again, you're talking about this idea of a crown. And so it ties into this idea of the fight, whatever the fight is, being against something that is an entity such as Leviathan. And the type of Leviathan that Hobbes is actually talking about in his particular discourse. Remember, knowledge is power. Take care. See you soon.